As a therapist, I've been seeing men for years who struggle with the cruelty of being left powerless as the fate of their unborn child was decided without their input. Men would come to me and say, "I wanted the child. I begged and begged her, but she said no." This issue of men and abortion exposes the underbelly of feminism in a couple of ways. We'll look at those and then turn to some recent evidence of the crumbling of the feminist narrative. And yes, men are good. The more men's emotional pain is marginalized, the easier it is to marginalize the needs of men. Imagine someone comes to you and tells you that the life or death of your unborn child was being deliberated and that you won't have any say in the matter. Just how would that feel? Then imagine the decision was made to terminate the pregnancy without any input from you. How might that feel? If you said angry, helpless, sad, guilty, ambivalent, overwhelmed, shocked, and more, then you'd be voicing the same feelings that 40 years of research tells us men experience in a similar situation. But we don't hear about that research or about men's emotional pain. All we hear about is her body, her choice, and a wall of indifference to the pain of men. This is one piece of the underbelly of feminism, their callous and ruthless disregard of men's emotional pain. The bottom line is that feminism has chosen to ignore the emotional pain of men in a selfish effort that dehumanizes men in order to further their own ideological standing. But why would this be? What's the payoff for avoiding the pain of men? My guess is that if you can promote the idea that men are not in emotional pain, then it's simple to conclude that men are not in need of services or compassion. The more men's emotional pain is marginalized, the easier it is to marginalize the needs of men. If feminists admitted, as the research has shown for years, that men experienced a great deal of pain from being excluded from the discussion of their child's life and death, then they'd have to factor in men's needs. This would be kryptonite to feminists, to have to admit that men had serious emotional needs and then deserved special consideration. It'd be putting a big gaping hole in the hull of feminism, which sails unimpeded on a narcissistic course. It's clear that this same tactic of denying the emotional pain of men is used in multiple feminist crusades. Domestic violence is just one example. Feminists claim men are never victims and don't suffer like women, and therefore they can just be ignored. This has led to thousands of shelters for women and very few for men. Or take false accusations where the rape accuser is protected with laws that make it illegal to hurt her feelings, while the falsely accused is hung out to dry and left unprotected while the press knows his name and ruins his reputation simply for being accused. Can you see how this same dynamic plays here? The accused is not seen as someone who has emotional needs, and if you don't have emotional needs, it's easy to just be ignored. Circumcision is another example of the denial of men's emotional and, in this case, physical pain, while the pains of females are given consideration for compassion and action. Paternity fraud is another example that comes to mind, and there's likely many, many more. In a humanitarian world, everyone would be considered. In the feminist world, the only ones to be considered are female. If feminists promoted themselves as the special interest group that they really are, it would seem a bit more genuine, but no, they promote themselves as being about equality, and this, of course, is a lie. We've seen how the man's pain is ignored, but there are other problems that arise from this underbelly. If you accept the one-sided her body, her choice idea and exclude the man from any conversation, then you're literally encouraging unilateral decisions in the relationship. This is clearly a no-no. Most therapists understand that decisions within a family are best made as a couple. The general rule is the more serious the decision, the more important to have the involvement of both spouses. The research is clear. One of the factors that increases the chance of domestic violence is unilateral decision-making. The work of CALLOUS helps in understanding this. Here's a quote from a research study. When relationship decision-making is placed in the hands of one partner alone, the risk of interpersonal violence dramatically increases. CALLOUS, 1997. Just imagine for a minute what sort of reaction would come to the idea that men should have unilateral decision-making powers in some other area of relationship. How about sex? He makes all decisions about sex. When, where, and how. Can you imagine the fevered shrieks of how unfair that would be? Or maybe he should have total power over money. Same shrieks. But when feminists and now women in general voiced this nutty idea that they should have unilateral power in decisions of the unborn child, they seem to think it's just fine. I'm not saying this is an easy problem to solve, but I am saying that giving one party unilateral power is not the best approach, and I think we can find ways to honor both spouses in this difficult process. But there is some good news. It looks like in some ways things are starting to get better. There was a BBC program titled It's My Baby Too that focused on the abortion experience from a man's perspective. To the program's credit, they do ask men about their experience. While this is a big step forward, this program also shows us some of the media's lace curtain tactics. The moderator asks the men why they don't talk about the emotions, and the men take responsibility for this, saying perhaps they were at fault for not speaking out, etc., etc. But wait. At one point, she interviewed 2 women who had multiple abortions, and one of the women basically said that she was afraid to bring up the topic with her man. She's afraid? Of what? This is a critical question for the moderator, but the moderator simply skipped over her statement and went on to the next woman. This would have been a perfect place to see why women are afraid to bring this up to men. Was she afraid of judgment? Afraid of his possible criticism? Those given total power need to be able to steward feedback about their decision, but this woman, and I'm sure many others, would rather just not say anything. Then the interviewer started showing her gynocentric ways. She starts claiming that there has been little research on men and abortions. This is false. I've been a speaker at 2 national conferences on men and abortion. I was fortunate to have met 2 prominent researchers at these meetings, Catherine Coyle and Vince Rue. They've been doing this work for years. But the host claims that there are very few studies on men and abortion. No. We'll scroll the various studies included in Catherine Coyle's research review in 2007 on men and abortion. Note there are about 50 studies as of 2007. The program seems to be employing the Lace Curtain Handbook when the host claims that only a handful of studies have been done. The research they did cite was basically feminist research from a pro-abortion researcher who does indeed have an interest in helping men, but seems to do so from a blue pill perspective. He wants to help men support the ladies. So maybe she meant there's only a handful of feminist studies. That might be true, but the male-friendly ones don't see the light of day. This is a tiny example of how the media for years has picked and chosen the research it wants you to see and has failed miserably in reporting on men and boys. Here's what she says.
In the 50 years since David Steele's historic act decriminalising abortion in most of the UK and changes in the law to allow abortion in many other countries, there have only been a handful of studies anywhere in the world into the psychological impact of abortion on men. Academics often steer clear of the subject for fear they'll be misinterpreted as furthering a pro-life or pro-choice agenda, depending on the extent of their findings.
And then the interviewer talks to a feminist who promptly makes my point. Listen to this.
Some people, of course, are not so keen on a more inclusive approach to helping men through the abortion experience. And one of them is UK newspaper columnist and feminist campaigner Sarah Dittam.
If we're talking about what accommodation institutions, so abortion providers or the NHS, should be making for men to discuss their feelings, I don't feel like they should be doing any more than they're doing already. The more you involve men, the more you take the focus away from women. You stop talking about this as a decision that a woman has to make with all the physical, economic, social and ethical considerations that she is going to put into that decision. And you're suddenly allowing this other person, who is in a physical sense very much a junior partner in the whole baby-making process, to be involved in that decision. You're kind of embracing him within the discussion. And that really shouldn't be our default.
Ah, yes. Men are junior partners in the baby-making process. Oh, boy, indeed. And the message is clear. Keep men's emotions out of women's issues. That's the feminist way. Then she goes on.
There's a sort of an inexorable slippage that happens. The more you talk about how men feel, the more the feelings of men become the centre of the conversation. Only women can have abortions. Only women have to deal with the, huge, potentially fatal consequences of going through with a pregnancy.
Oh boy. The more the feelings of men become the center of the conversation. Yeah, how about that? Can you see how she wants to just block out men from the experience? This is the marginalization of men. Way to go, feminism. Then there's the surprising legislation that was introduced in Oklahoma this year. It was introduced by a brave man named Representative Justin Humphrey, who had the massive courage to introduce a bill that would require the father's consent to perform an abortion in Oklahoma. Wow. I talked with his legislative assistant who said the bill was still in committee and might be heard next year, but that it was not well received by leadership, end quote, and she didn't think it had much of a chance. She was surprised to hear from anyone who offered thanks and congratulations for this bill, saying that it was all too often just the opposite. That could be predicted, right? But I think this is yet another indicator that the dam is under pressure. Will it ever break? Who knows? But what we do know is that men are good, as are you. If you like this video, please consider supporting my Patreon work. It's a cheap way to fight feminism. Like, subscribe, comment, and all that stuff.